Greetings to our international audience and welcome to this event entitled Who Inherits What, which you are viewing as part of the Kultursymposium Weimar and its festival Generations. My name is Alta L and I'm the curator and moderator of this event, which was co-organized by the Goethe-Institut New York. I'd like to request that viewers visit the festival webpage for full bios. I would love to give you the many accolades that both of our presenters have received today, but their full bios are worth visiting on the webpage right where you registered for this event. We will shape today's discussion around themes of identity and memory, what shapes us, and what stories we want to tell future generations. As I'm sure you all feel and know already, literature has the power to reflect and challenge our sense of ourselves, both as individuals and as members of a group, society, nation, or generation. The theme of inheritance, viewed in physical, economic, genetic, and cultural terms, is the core of many multi-generational tales. German author Anja Kampmann and American author Nadia Owusu join me today to discuss their latest books and how they relate to surprising intergenerational and intercultural inheritances. Anja's 2020 novel, High as the Waters Rise, originally Wie hoch die Wasser steigen, in German for our German language viewers, published by Catapult last year in a fabulous translation by Anne Poston, which was shortlisted for the National Book Award of Literature and Translation. And Nadia's 2021 memoir, hot off the press as of a month or two ago, Aftershocks, are different stories with interesting parallels. Their plots unfold in multiple countries, their characters experience profound personal loss, and they explore class divisions, memory, and identity from riveting, uniquely contemporary perspectives. In this time of global grieving, these two books also allow us to discuss trauma, its intergenerational effects, and what is both lost and gained in translation. With that, I would like to pass the microphone to Anja Kampmann. Anja, could you introduce High as the Waters Rise and give us a brief reading?
Yeah, sure. So I will read from High as the Waters Rise. The main character is Václav, an Ulrich worker who grew up in Poland and lived in Germany as the son of a coal miner. And the story starts off on an Ulrich offshore of Morocco. And there's a big storm, and it's Václav with his closest friend, Matthias. They've been working together for 7 years. Václav has been out there for 12 years. And I will read a brief passage from the first chapter. Václav realizes that his best friend and bunkmate has gone missing. And it's still night, and there's another worker called Petrov who's been with Václav, and it's like the shock of the loss of his friend. I can't let you stay out here, Wenzel. Come on in. He put his arm around Václav. It was an arm that knew that the next days too would taste of rain and clouds and of their passing. He couldn't stand to be in the cabin. He said Dobranoc to Petrov and went to the mess hall. Fat Lukas stood behind the counter and he wrung his chief's head between his hands when he saw Václav, as if he saw a shadow beside him. And he heard how they lowered their voices. Michael and Ray and Steve. Someone pushed back a chair. Wenzel, do you want to join us? Thanks, but I won't stay. But then he said anyway, a long line with an instant lemon tea, lukewarm in its paper cup. Enough silence to make their forearms stick to the tabletop. Have you guys seen these t-shirts? Bright red and green. Ray was wearing a washed-out sweatshirt with a manga print, a princess and a sword. A few feet separated his table from theirs. He noticed how they looked at him, how their eyes wandered so repetitiously over, as if it were his fault that no one was getting out the cards and they couldn't yell across the room to Lukáš, who absently wiped at the glass as if he'd only just noticed the film of grease on the divider before the shimmering meatballs. He wasn't sure it was the same room. He told Lukáš to fry him up a couple of eggs and ate them with some cold potatoes. Suddenly he was hungry. He was careful not to scratch the plate with his fork. It was no longer their mess hall, but it was the same room. At some point, a new decade had begun, and they'd sat there and played with all the strength of extinguished firecrackers. Matthias, young enough, lively. Never before had Václav spent a night at these tables. Never had he loved the sudden distance that surrounded them more. The smell of cabbage and fryer grease hung in the air. The door opened and Eugene stuck his head in. Václav, they are looking for you. They are going to send a super puma for you first thing in the morning. It's coming over from the mainland, just for you, a puma. He heard their voices rise and knew they'd start talking about helicopters now, weighing the pros and cons of particular models, among which the Puma superiority was unchallenged. He sat there and listened. Lukáš was shoveling down some kind of food. Then his gaze fell on the clock over the door. 11. What did that mean? 11 at night it must be. He looked out at the face of the clock and felt something rising in him. He could still hear their voices, made it to the hall and into the cabin, to the metal toilet bowl where he vomited, and it was night, simply night, and he sat there and saw his hands shaking as if they were someone else's, like this night in which he didn't belong. Everything that followed seemed too clear and yet somehow blurry, frayed images, their edges ungraspable. After an hour-long conversation, Anderson, the generous rig manager, had given him the last 4 days of his shift off. While he spoke, Václav thought of the birds that imitate rain to lure worms out of the soil. He didn't have the strength to ask him. Through the window of Anderson's office, Václav saw the men continuing to work, saw the rotary table, the colored work clothes, and glaring white helmets. The water had grown still, lay there, flat, and no one came and threw a breath in the water, a speech, anything. There was no place in his brain for a farewell without dark restaurants and brown sauce. He thought of the steel mills of the Ruhr, what he'd been told as a child about men who disappeared in the middle of the day, a white-hot heat after years spent between carnival and grain alcohol, after the misery of the war came, the silence of oak-side bogs, the cramped miner's estate, lives turned into less than ash in the boiling steel of the blast furnaces. As a child, he'd carried with him the image of locker rooms, street shoes, never worn again. Anderson asked several times if he wanted to go home. Several times Václav told him that the address he had listed as his emergency contact no longer existed.
Thank you so much, Anja. And I have so many thoughts that I'm going to hold on to for our conversation afterward. But thank you for ending on that concept of home, actually, which is a perfect way to segue into Nadia's piece. Nadia, could you introduce Aftershocks and give us a brief reading?
Sure. So I describe Aftershocks as a literary memoir with threads of cultural history to explore themes like the complexities of family, the meaning of home, the multiplicity of identity, and the ripple effects, both personal and generational, of trauma. And I explore those themes through the lens of my own identity as a woman who is Armenian American and Ghanaian, and grew up sort of in a UN family, kind of moving between Europe and Africa for most of my childhood. Although I am a US citizen, I hadn't lived here until I was 18. And I'll just read from the beginning of the book, from a chapter called First Earthquake. My mother's hair is long, straight, and black. It blows behind her in the wind. She is walking away again. In the moonlight, she is a phantom ship drifting out on obsidian waters toward the place where the sky and ocean meet, disappearing over the curvature of the earth, and the moment is so evanescent, so intangible, that I am already wondering, a wisp of her still in sight, if she was ever there at all. She does not turn to see me in the doorway. I am 7 years old, bundled up in a pink sweater and down-stuffed coat, my bobbled hat pulled down past my eyebrows. My white socks are dingy and damp from the rain that seeped into the black canvas shoes I insist on wearing no matter the weather. I want to call out to her, but am afraid she will not turn around. Or worse, that she will, but still won't choose me. She gets into the passenger seat of the blue Fiat her husband borrowed from an acquaintance. They are passing through Rome for a day on their way back to Massachusetts. They vacationed in Venice. Earlier, before my mother arrived without sign or signal, I woke up to the sound of rain. It was dark outside, so dark that it might still be night until I smelled pancakes. My father makes pancakes on Saturday mornings. As I ate my breakfast, face buried in a shabby copy of Little Women, my father fretted. He tapped his foot, peeped at his watch, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. I wondered what was making him anxious and hoped that whatever it was wouldn't require him to sit at his desk all weekend. He had just returned from a work trip to Dhaka. I wanted him to myself. The radio, always perched on the kitchen counter next to the toaster, its bent antenna somehow finding the BBC World Service, brought news of a catastrophic earthquake in Armenia. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes and everything in them. A city called Spitak was destroyed. A new city, the woman on the radio said, would have to be built over the ruins. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev asked the world for help. On my pancake, I spread butter and sprinkled sugar. Does Mama have family in Armenia? My father flinched, then looked at me with wide eyes magnified by Coke bottle glasses. No, he said, her family are Armenian, but they lived in Turkey. They are all in America now. We usually avoided the topic of my mother, but the BBC said this was an emergency. Rules are suspended in emergencies. I am half Armenian, but was not sure if the earthquake had anything to do with me. My Ghanaian father, stepmother Annabelle, sister Yasmin, and I live in Italy. This was the first I'd heard of the Caucasus Mountains, the fault rupture point that caused the event. I asked my father what an aftershock was. He said they are tremors in the earth that followed an earthquake. They are the earth's delayed reaction to stress. The doorbell rang just as I was about to go upstairs to brush my teeth. Yasmin, who had stumbled into the kitchen rubbing her eyes, jolted awake and scampered after me to see who it was. We hoped our friends from next door had come to play. Our mother was on the front porch with 2 red balloons and shaking hands. I stared at her. Remembering my voice, I shouted for my father to come. We hadn't seen my mother in 3 years, not since I was 4. My father nodded hello and sent Yasmin and me to get dressed. When we came downstairs, my parents were still standing in the hallway. They weren't speaking. My mother's hands were in her pockets. She had let go of the red balloons, and they had floated up to the ceiling. Her head dropped. My father's shoulders were drawn back, his legs spread apart. Your mother is going to take you for a drive. My father opened the closet and pulled out our puffy coats. I could feel him on the other side of the front door when he closed it behind us, as though to say he would be there exactly where we left him when we returned. My mother's husband drove, silent while my mother chattered. Our half-sisters were dying to see us. She would bring them next time. Venice was a magical place. She could hardly believe it was real. Our grandparents bought us a kite in the shape of a fish. Our father could show us how to fly it in the spring. Despite the drizzle, my mother's husband dropped us off in Piazza Navona. An artist drew a funny sketch of us together with bulbous heads and startled eyes. We ate at a cafe plates of spaghetti al pomodoro. All of us requested lots of Parmesan cheese. My mother asked about school and said she liked our house, even though, as far as I knew, she had only seen the hallway. I asked her about the earthquake. She hadn't heard the news. Someday we'll go to Armenia, she said. It sounded like half question, half statement, so I said yes, even though I didn't believe her. As we left the restaurant, a juggler swept over, grinning. His hands seemed to barely move, but his blue, yellow, and red clubs hurtled high above his head. He caught 2 in one hand and 1 in the other and bowed deep. My mother clapped. Yasmin and I, always tentative around strangers, considered the cracks in the paving stones. My mother pressed a few gold and silver 1,000 lira coins into the juggler's hand. She also gave 1 each to Yasmin and me to toss into the Fontana dei Quattro Fiumi. I told my mother what my father told me about the fountain, about how the 4 figures in it are the gods of 4 rivers on 4 continents, the Nile, the Ganges, the Danube, and the Rio de la Plata. Above the gods is an obelisk topped with a dove. The obelisk represents the Catholic Church. The river gods are powerful, but they prostrate themselves before the Vatican. The fountain is a symbol of colonialism, I whispered, echoing my father, who speaks to me like I'm a grown-up. Colonialism, as I understand it, is white people stealing land from black and brown people, white people beating and killing black and brown people, white people forcing black and brown people into slavery and servitude. My father, I know, was born in the last year of colonial rule in what was then the Gold Coast. He says being born as Ghana was being born was the beginning of his good fortune, of our good fortune. I liked that my mother laughed and told me I was smart. When I threw my coin into the water, I closed my eyes tight and listened to my mother's laughter sing with the sound of water. That sound was the wish I dared not shape into words, because words can be misconstrued. Now I watch my mother get into the blue Fiat. Her husband starts the ignition. To see her more clearly, I squint. She rests her head against the window, and I imagine, or perhaps hope, she is crying. The car pulls away, absorbed by the night. I sniff the air for exhaust or perfume, for any remnant of my mother's presence, but I smell only wet limestone and garlic. My stepmother Annabelle is cooking dinner. Piazza Navona seems far away now. We live in Eur, a neighborhood known by an acronym for the Esposizione Universale di Roma, a World's Fair that never happened because of the onset of World War II. Eur was built by Mussolini to celebrate 20 years of fascist Italy and to expand the city to the sea. Unlike the rest of Rome, Eur is an orderly place. Its buildings are solid, polished white, and arranged around a grid of right angles. Usually its predictability makes me feel safe, but now it feels inhospitable, spiritless. Somewhere in the house, my sister shrieks. She does not want to take a bath. Her anger, I know, is about something else entirely. With a last breath, I inhale whatever particles of my mother remain and close the door behind me. In the hallway, I remove my shoes. The marble floor is cold against my thin socks. Above me, the bulb my father keeps forgetting to change flickers from light to dark, then light again. Between my thumb and fingers is the Polaroid my father took of my mother, Yasmin, and me minutes ago. All of us blinked. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And I'm immediately just overwhelmed at how both of these passages from, profoundly different books here, we're talking sort of literary nonfiction memoir and then absolutely a novel. So many parallels from the sensuality of the food, of its very different types, to the various languages. So I'd like to start by asking you both sort of a key topic question about absence. Each of your stories forms around a conspicuous absence. In many ways, inheritance is the result of losing someone closely connected to you or to the person who inherits whatever it is. After key characters vanish in your books, how does their absence shape those left behind? And whichever of you wishes to take it first.
Yeah, I think absence is indeed very important for the book, and through the absence of Matthias and the loss, suddenly the life of Matthias and Václav takes shape. And before Matthias' accident, there was a time when Václav was already sort of at the edge, and he knew he couldn't go on with this hard oil-rig life. And but now that Matthias is gone, the life offshore has become meaningless. And I think that is sort of the key question, like what gives meaning to the life offshore, and how do you sort of find a way to deal with it. And suddenly Václav has to look back, and also I think a lot of the lies that they somehow had together in order to just go on and have this quick and or this fast life with a lot of money and a lot of drugs and posh hotels, it all comes to an end. So it's a very sudden stop, and someone who didn't want to think about his life for more than 12 years somehow has to sort of go back and ask himself where he ended up. And I think at the beginning he's sort of in shock, and he doesn't really come to realize what happened. So he's still in this mindset of everything will just go on, and it takes a while for him to realize that the life he used to live out there ended.
Yeah, I mean, I very much connect with what Anja just said about sort of meaning and trying to search for meaning within that absence. And in my memoir, I'm sort of exploring in part the story of my mother leaving when I was 2. And although I was too young to remember what my family was like before she left, her absence was something I felt profoundly and kind of worked to make meaning of throughout my life. And why she left was a question I carried, in my body even before I knew to ask it. And my sister and I were raised by our father, who is the great hero of my life, and he worked for a UN agency. So we moved to a different country every couple of years, which is a wonderful upbringing in so many ways, but also an upbringing that brings a lot of loss and absence. We would move just as we were settling into a place. We had to prepare to leave it. And from the piece that I read, the chapter that I read, that was, the story of my mother showing up when I was 7, when we were living in Rome after a very long absence, and my trying to kind of make sense of what she was doing there, who she was to me, and the fact that she showed up on the same day as a catastrophic earthquake that destroyed a city in Armenia kind of stuck with me, because I knew so little about the Armenian side of my family. And so, I remember very clearly asking my father about the possibility of aftershocks, and his answer really stuck out to me and sort of stayed with me. And, even after my mother left then, I think maybe because my mother is Armenian American, and maybe because my father kind of generally avoided talking about her, and I felt like I wasn't supposed to acknowledge her absence, the earthquake and my personal shaking or personal disaster at having her leave kind of conflated in me. And I became kind of obsessed with earthquakes, and specifically the ways we predict and measure disaster. And that sort of became a way for me to understand the losses that were to come in my life, and including my father dying of cancer when I was 13, and sort of trying to make sense then of his absence, and all of the homes that I had left behind as well. And so that really was the project of the book, both trying to understand those losses and absences, but also trying to find steady ground within my own stories, and to, in a way, write myself closer to connection and belonging, and remembrance, for my father in particular.
Also, I think what Nadia just said is also very true. I think maybe for any kind of writing, that this absence sort of forms memories, and that these memories are something very dear to the text, and something I also worked a lot with, like how do you form memory, or what is important to a character. And I think, this to bring all these memories together, and to show how someone really doesn't want to see them, and then they come up, and it's something, and Václav goes back to places where he was very close to his fiancée or his childhood, but they are everywhere. Like everything is suddenly connected to these memories, and still he just wants to go on and get rid of them. But yeah, I think that's something that's also caused by this big absence.
Yeah, certainly. One thing that struck me is, these how the absences, the characters or the figures in the story piecing together why and what that absence means, and the reader gets information at different times throughout. We'll get later on to how you structured your books, but certainly, Nadia, I think of how you learned about the earthquake before your mother even knew. At that point, you had this knowledge that she didn't, and just the implications of who remembers what, when, and how, and really how we can cast it off or not. But you've both also mentioned, so we've got the sheer physicality of the spaces that these books exist in. Nadia, interestingly, with aftershocks, we're talking about earthquakes and plate tectonics and things like that. But there is a strong element of water and ocean in your book as well, that connects everything. And it almost is, it feels too concrete, but it really does sort of connect for me in Anja's book, how the difference of the lives these men lead on solid ground, on land, versus when they're doing this incredibly grueling physical labor out in the middle of the sea. So I had a question that I stole straight from Nadia, a couple of your chapter titles about topography and terraforming. And this is, I'd like to talk a little bit about the craft of writing. For both of you, I'm wondering how you structure your books to approach the international nature of these stories. And I think, Anja, I sat in on one of the really lovely presentation you gave at NYU with Anne, and it came up, I think Ulibera pointed out that we're sort of, the national novel is, and not that it's gone, but we almost can't write national novels in the way that people used to, or a concept of nationality is no longer what people used to grab onto for identity. So if you could talk, each of you, a little bit about the international nature, or if international doesn't resonate with you, just the physicality of displacement and the physical space and time.
Yeah, it's a good question, because for me, this national aspect was something that is sort of in the past of this character. And when I thought about Václav and Matthias in this oil rig life, which is like very international and somehow connected to this old idea of freedom and traveling, yet it is something which is quite the opposite. I was also looking for places that somehow connect to this life, and so they share a room in Morocco, which is like at the edge of Europe, but not Europe. So that was also important to me, that they are always somewhere in between, somewhere a little bit outside, and they can go to a lot of places, but these places they seem to be unstable. There's this notion in the book that when an oil field is empty, the rigs get pulled away and there are no traces. And so the places in which Václav lives are quite similar. They are somehow he lives a life without traces, and that is quite the opposite to a life which is, born in Germany, and then also the old miners, they would sort of live in a small miners town, and then they get old and they get ill and they die, and the next generation follows. But for me, so there's this one place in outside Europe, And we have this long journey Václav made through Hungary, Malta, Italy, and further up north to Germany and Poland. But then there are also a lot of snippets from his past and from this oil rig life in Mexico and in other places, but they are not really connected. I mean, I know when everything took place, but they are just somehow woven into the text as if they really don't have a place, and that was somehow important to me. Also, Václav has a lot of different names, and this. But I also had this map in my head, and when I wrote it, it always seemed like, even if he's in a place where he's got his room and he's got work to do or something, he's still not quite in the place. He still doesn't belong, and that's maybe the only thing that all the places in the book have in common, that he's not really part of any community.
Yeah, I mean, so again, that sense of not really belonging anywhere is something that I felt for much of my life. You know, my father being Ghanaian, my mother being Armenian American. I didn't grow up in either of those cultures, really. Much of my father's family live in the UK, and so I spent a lot of time with them in the UK. I don't speak Twi, my father's language. Because I'm Black, when I was visiting my mother's family in the United States, some people assumed I was adopted. I was born in Tanzania. I lived in Italy, England, Ethiopia, Uganda, just moving around a lot. And again, that was I'm so grateful for so much of my upbringing. And yet at the same time, there were, I often felt like an outsider, even in my own families. And there was often a demand that was made of me, or expectations placed on me to sort of answer the question to where I was from in a very specific way that I couldn't understand. When people would ask me the question, it was actually quite anxiety inducing, because if I answered honestly, people would be very confused, or would sometimes sort of suggest that I might not be truthful. And so it often became attached to this sort of fear of rejection that I had. And in many ways now, as an adult looking back on it, I think about the concept of the nation state, and, even the concept of the African nation state is complicated because the lines were drawn by colonization in the first place. At the same time, my father had a very Pan-African worldview, and so was always sort of talking about solidarity across the Black diaspora. And that gave me something to kind of connect to in some ways, and to belong to in some ways. And so I was thinking a lot about that as I was writing. And then also just allowing myself to sort of reject these notions that were placed on me, or the demand to see my identity as fixed. And rather to kind of define home and family really expansively, and to claim all of the places and people that I've lived among and loved and tried to belong to, and sort of shift the way that I looked at my life as not belonging anywhere, and beginning to ask myself, what would it look like if I belonged everywhere, and if I saw myself as someone who has really expansive roots as opposed to someone who is rootless. And so, with that in mind, the question of how to structure a memoir about a life like mine that was lived on borders and boundaries between cultures and continents was something I grappled with for a long time. And I think in America in particular, there's this sort of, or at least I got a lot of sort of feedback as a writing student that, I had to think more in a linear way. And that was really difficult for me, because my brain just doesn't work that way. But then, as I was writing into the story, I realized that I was writing into this kind of metaphor of earthquakes that has sort of been a guiding metaphor for my life, and that I've sort of lived inside for a long time. And realizing that the story of an earthquake is not linear and is not easily understood, except in retrospect. Sometimes it turns out that what we thought was the earthquake was actually a foreshock, and then you have to reshuffle the story. And so that's sort of what I was trying to do here as well, because my story is a memoir, but I'm also trying to connect very deeply to the histories that shaped my family's lives. So the history of the Armenian genocide that brought my mother's family to America, the history of the Ashanti tribe that my father came from before colonization, which is a history that is largely not taught anywhere. I certainly didn't learn about it in school, and so was really trying to narrate myself closer to those histories and show how those histories are present in our everyday lives. And in fact, in the Ashanti culture, we do believe that our ancestors are present in our lives and that past and present coexist, and time is not a straight line. It's circles and we move in and out of them. And so that's sort of what I was trying to capture with the structure of the book, and it felt more honest to my experience, and I think to so many experiences. I think that was part of my fear of rejection was connected to this need that some people have for binaries and linearity, and that just was, I rejected that because it wasn't serving me anymore. And so once I realized that I was going to give myself the freedom to move back and forth in time and place, which is really how I lived my life, then things started to make a lot more sense to me.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful.
I'm so glad that you resisted that impulse to please someone else and really tell your story, because you tell it beautifully. Yeah, I think I have too many questions for both of you, but we'll fit them all in. I'll make this one short. Apropos of light and lightness, and I'm thinking of the concepts, and this actually came up in both of the readings, the excerpts that both of you read today. Had this nighttime darkness. So both of the prose that both of you write has been praised for its brightness and luminous qualities. And I also want to point out, Anja, you're also operative as a poet. So you're not just, both of you write in multiple genres, if we want to even label things with, it's writing. Might this brightness or luminous quality be a response to the dark or heavy nature of the material, or is it something else entirely for you as two writers?
Would you like to start, Nadia?
Sure, I can start. In many ways, once I realized, I started writing from a place of grief, and actually the book started as a private project. It wasn't something that I thought I would publish. I was writing a novel, and that's the story that I thought I would put out into the world. But this material kept calling to me because I think it was a process of discovery for me and illumination in some ways of these histories that were so much a part of who I am and that I carry in my body, but was not aware of. And so once I realized that, I was really writing, yes, from grief, but toward love and connection, and trying to remember kind of the beautiful moments spent with my father, the joy I found in many of the countries I called home, and even eventually sort of writing myself toward reconciliation with my mother, after a decade-long estrangement. And so once that sort of feeling began to take shape and urgency began to take shape, that's what I was writing toward, then I think it shaped my language too. I was searching for that light and the light of new understanding and care, for myself and for others. And for me, that didn't mean not writing about the difficult things. There is a lot of grief and loss in the book, but I wanted to be willing to face the difficult things and to be honest and open about my pain and also the harm I inflicted on others. But ultimately, to search within those stories for new possibilities in the world. And I think that sort of searching was what really kind of shaped my language as I was writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the way you describe it. For me, it was also the start with this feeling of loss. And I think some people, when they talk about the novel, they say it's so full of grief and heavy. But at the same time, I really felt that the perception of Václav and the perception of the world is still something very, it has a lot of light. And also there's this sort of search for hope or for a new way. and I thought, for me, it was also, I think, a bit different because I needed to find the voice for a character who was very much not me and not who didn't have my experience, and also not my kind of language. But then I felt that through language and through all the things that he sees on his journey, I could somehow point towards parts of this Ulrich worker or this character, which no one would really expect from someone like him. So for me, I think it always goes together, this sort of dark side, grief, but then also the very beautiful moments, and I tried to really work with language in a way that somehow invites the reader to sort of be part of this journey. And even if it's not, I mean, from the first page you realize this is not easy, this is not going to be easy, but still you have all these little details and that somehow show you and bring you really close to this character. So for me, it was also a way to sort of open up a world which would normally be sort of closed for us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I know also in the translation process, having talked to your translator, a lot of research was involved in getting all that term, like this entire world that you create, bringing it across languages. So it's nice to know that you both had that the research experience. Sorry, what were you going to say?
No, just that Anne Poston did such a great job in getting it all back into English. Because when I did my research, everything was mainly in English because the Ulrich world is an English-speaking one. So I had to find terms in German, and she had to sort of go back. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a good segue into, I've got one final question for each of you. And Anja, I was wondering, aside from obviously a broader readership for your book, what did your novel gain in translation? Did the process have any surprises aside from, that the one that you just mentioned of operating between these languages in the process of writing?
For me, it was the first time such a long text got translated, and it was, I think it somehow changes your perspective on your own work. When I was talking to Anne, she had so many questions, or we were talking so much about the story, and it was something, how to say it? Yeah, I just came to, I had another sort of point of view on my own book and work, and also, I don't know, it's somehow, just very exciting to sort of see the transformation into another language.
Thank you. And Nadia, I actually meant to ask you earlier whether your book is going to be translated into any other languages.
Yeah, so it has been translated into Dutch and also into Swedish, and it will be translated into German as well so far. Those are the ones. Yeah.
Excellent. So, and this is my final question is also for you, Nadia. Reading your book, I felt the process of writing it might have been your way of creating firm ground for yourself and your body. Can you speak more about the physicality of the story? Unless that's too big of a question to end on, in which case we can wrap it up with the translation question.
I think I can, it is a very big question, but I can speak to it sort of very briefly, just a sort of a little bit of a reflection, which I spoke to a little bit earlier. I've always had this awareness because this was sort of part of my father's worldview as well. And it was really important to him And he really emphasized, when we were moving around, and I went to international schools most of my life, and never did we study African history. And it was so important to my father that we, studied African history. And so he made that sort of his project. And I think through his emphasis on that, I've always had this awareness that we carry history in our bodies and that we are history kind of living and breathing, and that's a big part of how I walk through the world. And I even remember vividly, my father, as I said, didn't talk about my mother very much, but we did have a conversation that really stands out to me, in which he told me about the trauma of the Armenian genocide and how that trauma was carried by my mother's side of the family. And, I didn't know anything about epigenetics. I was a child. But now, sort of in kind of looking back on it, I think he was speaking to the ways that trauma actually can change our genetic makeup and be inherited. And that idea really did stick with me. And so a big question that I was sort of writing into was that question of how history shapes, not just our experience and choices, but who we are and how we feel in the world and how we move through the world in our bodies. And so, in terms of physicality, that was something I was trying to interrogate for myself. How does history shape the way I move, and how we move through the world and how we're in relationship with one another?
Excellent. Thanks so much. Well, unless either of you have any final observations, we can, I think, call it a day. I'd like to thank you both so much for the beautiful books. And I'd like to thank everyone who came to this event. And I would just like to put in a plug, please go to your favorite local bookstore and pick up one or both of these books. Do either of you have a local bookstore, an independent bookstore to recommend? I bought mine at Unabridged Bookstore in Chicago.
Yeah, Books Are Magic and Greenlight are my Brooklyn-based bookstores that I spend a lot of time at.
Ja, mein Konnewitzer Verlagsbuchhandlung in Leipzig.
Marvelous. Nadia and Anja, thank you so much for your beautiful work and for this discussion. And I really look forward to reading anything you write next. I know you're both working on your next projects. So with that, we'll sign off, and thanks again.
Thank you very much.